Welcome to History 275, and we're not going to be having a lot of lectures, but I did want to start off by discussing a few different aspects of and issues related to the discipline of history, particularly as corresponds to your first reading, John Arnold's History, a very short introduction. So we're going to consider, different kind of questions related to, what is history, what does it mean to study it, what are, the concerns historians are confronted with, what is the relationship between history and the past, between history and the truth, and so forth. Well, let's start with, this kind of relationship between history versus the past, because that is probably one of the primary confusions that emerge when people think about history. History is not the same thing as the past. It is the end product of what historians do. It is an attempt by historians to create a picture of what we think the past might have looked like, based very often on a relatively small number of clues. Related to this, we really do need to clarify what the term historiography means, right? So the simplest definition of historiography, it can mean, well, kind of two things. The process of writing history, so how we create a picture of what we think happened in the past, or it can mean the study of that process. Another way to put it, the history of history, right? How has the telling of history evolved, changed, and so forth? Could be in general, could be with respect to a particular historical topic. Historians do more than simply present a vignette or a small tale, just a story about, something that happened in the past, right? We interpret the past. We try to place, maybe a number of small tales within a larger context that give those different tales meaning. The point is not simply to say what happened, but also what it meant. So that also means, right, we could look at the same small tale and contextualize it in a number of different ways with respect to different broader stories, different kinds of histories, if you will. So for instance, the same event could be, part of a bigger story about a particular religion. It could be, that same tale, if it reflected kind of criminal behavior, could be about the history of crime. We could look at it in relation to, other kinds of developments related to education, related to population growth, related to economic developments, and so forth, right? But in every case, it could be the same small story that we're putting into a different context, right? So that's kind of important to remember. So we cannot know the truth about the past, right? I mean, it's unknowable, but we can approach this enterprise with a kind of integrity, whereby, as if to say, if I could know the truth, that would be my objective, and I'm going to try my darndest to get as close to the truth of the matter as possible, which is not to say that there is only one possible interpretation of historical facts to begin with, right? But I'm going to stick to the evidence, and I'm going to really try to, interpret the evidence to the best of my ability, in an honest way, to what they seem to be truly saying. I'm not going to invent facts. I'm not going to ignore facts. I'm not going to try to, force a square peg into a round hole in terms of how I interpret a fact and so forth. And I recognize I'm going to try, you're going to have to use your imagination to link together facts, right? But I recognize that there are probably multiple ways of doing it. Some that are probably more legitimate than others, and I'll try to be mindful of that. But there probably will not be just one way of actually, constructing a picture based on historical facts of what I think happened. History is in many ways like a jigsaw puzzle, right? Each historical fact, if you will, is a piece of the puzzle, right? The problem is, imagine that, the puzzle ideally should consist of 100,000 pieces, but we only have, say, 10,000. roughly, right? Each of those pieces is a historical fact of which we are aware. And by the way, there are such things as historical facts. These are kind of, like the most basic elements, the pieces of the puzzle, if you will, of, the story that we're trying to create. So just to give an example, the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776 is a fact. What that actually signified, that becomes interpretation. And you could give many such examples. There are some historical facts that are debatable, but the debatable aspect of it is part of its factual truth, if you will, right? So there could be, three different accounts about the number of casualties at the same battle, three different numbers, right? The historical fact part of it would be to account for all three numbers that have been given. But again, right, what we do with these historical facts, that's kind of like, well, how, where do we put the pieces of the puzzle to create a picture? And if you're missing so many pieces, there's obviously going to be a lot of educated guesses about how to fill them in. And of course, the fact that there's so many missing spaces means that, a particular piece might be placed in a number of different parts of the puzzle, right? Because there's all that guesswork involved. Eventually, though, right, as we start laying down our pieces, let's say a picture emerges, right? And it's true, we will never have a complete picture, but at some point, certain elements become clear, right? So I've oversimplified with this example here, right? But for instance, if the picture were of an animal instead of, a past development, let's imagine at some point that it's pretty clear, that the picture emerging is an elephant. And there's a consensus among many different historians who've, tried to engage all the historical facts, all the pieces of the puzzle honestly, that this is definitely an elephant. What kind of elephant it is, that is probably debatable. But there are limits in how far we can stretch our interpretation of the historical facts. For instance, in this case, we definitely don't have a tiger, right? This is relevant when we consider historical works, or shall we say works that claim to be historical, that probably didn't go through peer review, weren't evaluated by other historians, that make radical claims. To give an example, the idea that the Holocaust never happened. But if you look more closely at the work, you find problems. For instance, that they are not being honest about possible interpretations of a particular historical fact, that they are omitting very important pieces of the puzzle, just leaving them out. I want to make my elephant a tiger. Well, I'm going to leave out all the pieces that really make it hard to do that. An example might be, we're not going to even mention the Wannsee Protocols, right? Which the minutes of a meeting of all the high-ranking Nazis and German military leaders where they came up with the final solution for the Jews, right? I mean, if you're trying to argue that the Holocaust never happened, it would be very convenient to ignore that. The problem is, if you pick up that book and you're not that familiar with the basics of that history, you might not realize that the author is doing this. We'll get to it later, but that's kind of where peer review comes in, right? That historical books, articles, and so forth should be examined by other historians before they're put out there, right? Because, obviously a historian of the Holocaust would pick up on that immediately. Well, we might start with, I said historiography can be kind of the history of history, if you will. So if we start with the beginnings of history, first we should note, right, the most basic definition of the word would be to inquire. I mean, that's the initial meaning of the term history. For instance, as in between two conflicting accounts of events, right? But if we're talking about the earliest history, the objective was in some ways very different from what we imagine history should be about today, right? It wasn't simply about telling what happened. Very often you were telling a story to serve a larger purpose. It might be, to promote a particular belief system. or to promote a particular ruler or particular people, and so forth. So early historians, for instance, Herodotus, who is pictured here, often portrayed as the father of history, the first historian, very readily mixed facts with myth, right? Often with the purpose other than simply telling what happened. That wasn't really his objective. Part of it was about entertaining. In the case of Herodotus, he had, very specific ideas about the role of fate and ideas about how history continuously repeats itself. So he wasn't overly concerned about the reliability of, shall we say, the pieces of his particular puzzle. Very often, he already knew, what he wanted the picture to be before he laid down the pieces, might be one way to put it. So one really important development with the advent of Christianity is going to be how history is conceived. It has nothing to do with like a greater concern for factual content, but whereas up until this point, history very often seen as something that kind of moved in a circle and repeated itself. Fate was a very major aspect of determining outcomes. We now have the idea of history as something linear, something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. In this case, beginning with creation and then ending with the apocalypse, Judgment Day, and kind of the end of time, if you will. History is now headed somewhere, and it has a purpose to justify the Christian faith against paganism. There is an eternal battle between spirituality and wickedness, but there will be an end. There's a protagonist who will eventually win out against the enemy, and time will find an end. But again, it's still not about the factual content per se. What really matters is the conclusion that you want to draw, and related to that, rhetoric, the art of speaking, or in this case, writing persuasively, is going to become very important. Right? Your account should be persuasive and fluid. It should read easy. And ultimately, it's not really about the content, it's more about how you say it. Content does matter, though, but in this case, facts are going to take a back seat to the conclusion that you want to draw, right? You're trying to convince the reader of something. You're going to highlight those facts that are going to work to your advantage. You're going to minimize those that don't. You might even leave them out altogether. Really good example of that would be the life of Edward the Confessor, historical account of an English king that entirely leaves out probably the definitive event in his personal history where he lost the throne to William the Conqueror with the Norman invasion, the Battle of Hastings, right? But the point of the book was to show Edward in a positive light. So they just left that particular event and related individual out. And in fact, through most of the Middle Ages, is primarily about either promoting a particular ruler or promoting the Christian faith. There's not a tremendous concern with the reliability of facts or in fact, making sure that you account for all of them. Medieval historians will very often kind of stitch together early works, only including those bits that really suit their purposes, right? Kind of leaving other stuff out. Eventually, we get to the Renaissance, at which point facts are going to begin to matter a bit more. It helps to kind of remember what the Renaissance was about. The term literally means rebirth, the idea that they were picking up where the classical tradition of the ancient Romans and Greeks had left off. Helpful is to remember that it was intellectuals of the Renaissance that actually invented the term Middle Ages, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, as the period in between, what they perceive to be a period of intellectual stagnation. So that's where we get this kind of framework of kind of ancient history, medieval or Middle Age history, and then the modern period. And even today, historians often talk about the modern period beginning around the time of the Renaissance. Sometimes we use the term early modern period. So facts are beginning to matter a bit more, right? Learning for the sake of learning, knowledge for its own sake becoming more important. But it is still ultimately about kind of making a point. It might not be a religious one now. It might be more a philosophical one. In fact, history is perceived during this period as a subset of philosophy. So rhetoric is more important than ever. And we might also remember that this is kind of also corresponding to the time of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So both Protestants and Catholics are marshaling facts in order to demonstrate that their particular version of the faith is the correct one, that the other one is wrong. So again, facts still kind of taking a back seat with respect to the point that one is trying to make. But something is also beginning to change, and in fact, that kind of change begins a bit earlier than the Renaissance, during what we might call the High Middle Ages. There is starting to be, at least among some scholars, a greater concern with getting the facts right. By the 11th century, there's this kind of growing criticism, and also recognition that facts are being used as propaganda, right? There's kind of a disinterest for getting facts right. People are leaving out facts, are misrepresenting other facts, and so forth. And this is happening to such an extent that some critics are arguing that history is pretty useless. I mean, you really, from the histories that we're reading, you're not really going to learn anything reliable about what happened in the past. And at some point, somebody feels it necessary to defend the whole discipline that's beginning to develop, right? And that happens in 1566 with Jean Bodin, who, in the process of defending history, does acknowledge that there are a lot of problems and that readers of history should be suspicious of past historians, their purposes, methods, and biases. But this is a really important development. This kind of reflects the idea that historians are starting to take a more critical, analytical view of the accounts that they're reading. And by the end of the 16th century, there is kind of this growing consensus that history should be about, somehow constructing a quote-unquote true story of the past. And one really important development that in some ways is happening independent of the emergence of a discipline we might call history involves the activities of individuals known as antiquarians. So these are individuals who really just collect stuff because they think it's cool to collect stuff. Usually they focus on a particular region, a particular time period, kind of the idea they want to collect everything related to maybe a particular kind of development. But they're not historians, right? They're not trying to construct a narrative about what happened in the past. They're not trying to understand why things happened. They just like collecting stuff. What's really important here, though, is they're really tremendously concerned with the reliability of the things that they're collecting, that they are actually what they portend to be. So they become really good at examining. It could be documents, it could be coins, it could be artifacts, but really, trying to determine whether they are what they supposedly are. In the case of documents, for instance, very concerned about the language, right? So they're developing skills to help them examine the reliability of the things they collect. The case of documents, philology, the study of language, right? So for instance, learning the, exact form that Latin took in, say, the 12th century. And so if they're looking at a document that is attributed to a particular individual from that period, making sure that that language, the language in the document, could have been written in that period. So to give an example would be as if, I found a letter supposedly written by George Washington and he signed off with, "It's all good," right? I mean, most of us today would realize, that doesn't sound like, it's English, right? And we know that he wrote in English, but that doesn't sound like English from the 18th century in colonial or early American history. So that's kind of a, kind of more simplistic kind of example, right? But the point is, right, so they become very knowledgeable about languages. If they're interested in artifacts related to the Roman period, for instance, corresponding to Roman law, they become experts on Roman law in a way that allows them to determine, if they are looking at a new document, whether it really is Roman, whether it really came from that period. Really, one very important thing is learning to identify forgeries. If they're interested in coins. We see the development of individuals known as numismatists. So these are people who have kind of a special knowledge about coins from different periods, and very can probably very quickly determine whether a new coin presented to them is what someone claims it to be. It could be, pottery. For instance, even today you have people who can look at pottery from ancient China and very quickly identify, whether it authentically belongs to a particular dynastic period or not. So these are going to be very useful tools for the historian, right? So the historian is eventually going to adopt these tools in order to more critically examine the documents that they're looking at, but also helping them to better interpret them. And that brings us to the Enlightenment, where it really is increasingly becoming, this idea that history should be primarily about understanding some true account of the past, still linked to philosophy, right? There's still this idea that we're trying to, explain the nature of human existence and the workings of the world. But, part of what helps us to understand human behavior is to see how it functioned in the past, right? So then, in order to achieve our objective, it really does matter that we get our account of past behavior correct, so that we might better learn from it. So we are going to see one important development here, right? Up until this point, even to the extent that history becomes about getting it right, there is a tendency to focus on political documents written by governments, kings, important people, and so forth. Kind of this idea that it is great men, the occasional great woman, but very few, that drive history. So we very often refer to this kind of history as political history, right? Where we're focusing on important people, on governments, on great battles, on actions taken by important men, and so forth. With the Enlightenment, there's a kind of a concern for understanding human behavior in terms of large groups of people. So kind of looking at it from a kind of more societal perspective, meaning that they're going to focus on other kinds of factors, not just political documents, the actions of supposedly important men, but also trying to understand how things play out based on geographical factors, climatic factors, economic ones, the nature and composition of society, and so forth, right? So that's kind of eventually going to be a very, very important aspect of how we do history. And if you look at the syllabus, you see that different weeks we're going to look at different subgenres of history based on kind of greater focus on economics, greater focus on social factors, greater focus on cultural factors, and so on. So Enlightenment thinkers wanted to approach the study of history scientifically, meaning they wanted to get their facts right. They want to get, somehow get to a true understanding of why things happened the way they did in the past, so they can have a better understanding of human nature, the nature of human existence, and so forth. And that's really very rapidly bringing us to the birth of the modern discipline of history, right? So the Enlightenment promoted the idea of a trans-historical universality of human nature. Why do they want to get it right? We really want to understand human behavior because we think all of humanity is essentially the same. Human beings are human beings, and if we really want to understand why humans behave the way they do, we need to look at their behavior in the present in terms of what today we call sociology, but also in the past in terms of history. And we really can only arrive at a true understanding of human behavior by careful and critical inquiry. And this is where we see a joining together of the antiquarians' emphasis on documentary detail and the Enlightenment's philosophical approach to history, right? I mean, we're using the tools being developed by antiquarians in order to more critically examine the evidence we have about past human behavior to arrive at a truer understanding of it. And some would argue that the first proper history, in the sense of how we understand history as a discipline, today was Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So it really did reflect this combining of the antiquarians approach with philosophy. And there's also a fair amount of rhetoric involved. There's still this idea that you want to argue your case persuasively, but first and foremost, it should be factually based. So some have argued that Edward Gibbons is the first modern historian. I want to be a bit careful with that. Still got a long way to go at this point in terms of, developing a truly critical analytical approach in terms of how we use past documents and so forth. So this is certainly not an argument for saying that if you want a really good account of the history of the Roman Empire, you should go to Gibbons. A lot is going to happen between him and now. In terms of better understanding of the documentary evidence, also archaeological evidence and so forth. But still, in terms of the approach, in terms of how he goes about doing what he does, you could make the case that he is the first modern historian. Or it may be better to say that it was Leopold von Ranke. And von Ranke is often presented as like the really first proper historian. And in some ways, he does lay the foundation for what history as a discipline will become. So he's kind of, corresponding to certain kinds of developments taking place during the late 18th and 19th centuries. And so at some point, historians, this is kind of coming out of the Enlightenment, are developing all these theories to explain historical events, because remember, the ultimate objective is to have a kind of a better understanding of the nature of human existence. But they are taking a much more critical analytical approach in terms of the sources. Some are starting to recognize, though, that, we still have a long way to go in terms of, just kind of having a basic factual understanding of what happened in the past. Never mind trying to develop theories to explain it. Maybe we should be focusing on what happened and not why it happened. So, Leopold von Ranke is saying, maybe we're trying to go too far, right? In terms of, we have our archival sources, and then we're developing theories of causation based on factors, and that's good. I mean, that's how you should do it. But maybe we're too focused on the theory. Maybe we're kind of like, forcing the facts to some degree to conform to the theories we come up with. So he's like, let's focus on getting the facts right, on the archival documents, not allowing our imagination to run amok, what he would, call imaginative inspiration. That's great, but, maybe these grander philosophical questions are a bit beyond what we know up until now. And so he very famously really, tried to encourage historians to focus on just getting the historical facts right in terms of what happened before worrying too much about why it happened. Very famously, he said, our job is only to say how it really was. Now, that might sound, at that time, that probably was a legitimate concern. But, that very phrase is going to raise a lot of questions about, well, do historical facts speak for themselves? I mean, can we actually say, just by looking at the facts, that this is exactly what happened? Or even if we think we're not constructing a theory, are we inherently doing so just by deciding that these facts correspond to a particular narrative of what happened? And so I don't want to get too deeply into that, but that is a major question that we're going to explore as we move forward in this course. Now, coming back to the development of the discipline of history, von Ranke, very important in connection with its institutionalization. Not just him, but he is kind of a driving figure in this regard. By the end of the 19th century, history has really become this kind of professionalized institution, right? So you kind of have, and when I talk about institutions, I'm kind of talking about how history is actually conducted within the framework of the university. So you have a faculty made up of individuals considered to be proper historians. They've somehow demonstrated a certain level of expertise. And part of that institutionalization is then how the one generation kind of passes the torch to the next one. So you have seminars made up of historians, younger students who are learning their craft from established scholars in the classroom, but then very often being mentored in the development, for instance, of a PhD thesis, writing their dissertation, so forth. And then also we're going to start to see kind of growing specializations in the field, kind of the idea that historians should focus on very specific agendas. So for instance, when I became a historian, and I went to the University of St. Andrews where I got my doctorate, at some point I had to write a dissertation. So at some point, you kind of have to narrow the focus of your study. I'm a historian of modern Middle East, but then when you're talking about my research, I'm really focusing on what we call British Mandate Palestine, period roughly corresponding to the 1920s and 30s, when Palestine was effectively under British colonial rule. And then with my dissertation, I really focused on one particular topic: Muslim-Christian relations within the Palestinian Arab community. And by the way, this is very similar to how things operate in many disciplines, right? Someone becomes a marine biologist. At some point, you focus on one specific kind of phenomena. So, for instance, I have a friend who's a marine biologist. He focuses, in terms of his research, almost primarily on the movement of fish, right? Not just fish, the movement of fish, right? So, of course, he has, pretty good understanding of all topics pertaining to marine biology. He can teach it. Probably knows more about biology in general than the average person. But, in terms of his own research, what he really has, kind of tremendous expertise regarding, it's this one very narrowly defined phenomena. Same thing going on in history. So where to begin with actually doing history? And when I became a PhD student, I had no idea what I was going to write my thesis on. So, you have some kind of general interests, broader topics that, I knew something to do with probably Palestine and so forth. But, how do you actually develop a thesis, kind of a decision to focus on a particular kind of query? And in this case, I began by just reading stuff, right? So you're looking at these kind of what we might call, small episodes in the archive, these accounts you read, maybe written by a consul or a diplomat operating in the Ottoman Empire, say around 1898, writing about some incident involving a British citizen or whatnot. That is not history, right? Those individual episodes don't become history until you kind of like make it part of a broader context or narrative. These are kind of the building blocks, right? So you're going to find many, many individual episodes like this, and until you kind of, see a way to connect them, we can't really talk about history. They are the building blocks. We need to construct a house. The house is the broader narrative by which we pull them together. And as we look at more and more sources, maybe we start to see a pattern emerging, right? A way to connect them, which in a sense is kind of, we're starting to imagine the design of our house, right? How to take these individual building blocks and then bring them together in order to construct a house, the house being the broader historical narrative that we come up with. And, remember, history very often is almost always actually about not just explaining what happened, but trying to understand why things happened the way they did. And, again, it's sometimes very difficult to come up with that broader narrative. You often start by looking at these kind of individual small episodes or stories of things in the past. Now, of course, we need to evaluate the reliability of these accounts and think very carefully about what they signify in terms of how they might connect with other accounts and so forth. So there are many, many questions we have to address. One is that concerning bias. So let's start by noting there is no such thing as an unbiased source. Every source represents a particular perspective. And when I say bias, I don't necessarily mean the way we use the term in a kind of more day-to-day language, the idea of a prejudice rooted in racism or sexism. Though, by the way, I mean, very often that might be evident within a particular historical source, historical account. But the main thing is that every source has a certain subjectivity to it, right? There is no such thing as a purely objective account, even where the author perhaps is trying their hardest to be objective, right? Ultimately, it's always going to reflect the perspective of a particular individual. And in order to really properly interpret that document, we need to get to the heart of what that is. Having said that, bias is not inherently a bad thing, right? I mean, on the one hand, in terms of certain kind of very factual information, number of people in a battle, the weather that day, the exact time and day that a particular event occurred. Of course, you'd like to try and get to the objective truth of the matter. But in some ways, we're actually more interested in, what the inherent bias tells us about the mindset of people at that time, how they understood things, the opinions of different individuals, different groups. So if I were looking at a document regarding Christopher Columbus's first encounter with Native Americans, obviously some of the more kind of factual information, you do have to be very careful about how reliable that is and so forth. If you can find like a number of different accounts that corroborate one another about certain factual information, that's very helpful. But in some ways, I'm kind of more interested in what the documents tell me about kind of, the attitude of Spaniards at that time with respect to Native Americans. And if, for whatever reason, I were able to find a written account by Native Americans, somehow it got written down, that would tell me perhaps something about their perspective, perception of the Spaniards when they arrived. And in some ways, that's actually more interesting. Now, of course, in order to properly understand the mindset of people, certain skills are involved. Obviously, in the example I just gave, you should probably know Spanish. Foreign languages are very much among the tools used by historians. I do Middle East historians, so a knowledge of Arabic is very important. But even if you were a native Spanish speaker, in the case of the history of the Spanish encounter with Native Americans, you'd have to have a good understanding of the nuances of the Spanish language from the late 15th century, the fact that some words were used differently back then than the way they're used today and so forth, right? So, those kind of skills that we kind of associated with the antiquarians become really relevant in this regard. And that kind of brings us to this kind of broader question about, as per von Ranke, who said, just tell it the way it happened, do sources speak for themselves? No, they don't. I mean, the simple answer is until you give them context, they really don't tell you anything. To some degree, even about the very, narrowly defined episode they might be relating, until we have a broader context, we really can't have a full appreciation of the significance of that episode. I mean, just to give an obvious example, was it an exceptional occurrence, what's being related here? Was it typical? A very important bias would be, for instance, if the author indicated that this was kind of typical, but upon further research, we learned that it was not. I mean, that we have very little evidence that something the author claimed happened all the time, in fact, didn't. So even that, we can't, the accuracy of that particular description, we can't really evaluate until we have the broader context. And then, we should recognize, too, that no matter how many pieces of the puzzle you find, how many historical facts you come up with, how many primary sources, we haven't really talked about this, primary sources, accounts written by individuals directly, some fashion directly related to the historical development or event that we're interested in. No matter how many of these we have, there's still going to be a tremendous amount that is missing. Right? And so we're going to find ourselves having to make a lot of guesses, or shall we say bridges, that help us to connect the pieces of the puzzle that we do have. And remember, like at the beginning of this lecture, we had the, kind of this idea of a jigsaw puzzle of an elephant where many of the pieces are missing. So it's, we make educated guesses at some point. As we collect more evidence, some of those guesses will be to some degree validated, others will be discredited, and so forth. And we should be prepared to make changes as proves necessary. But we should always be aware of the fact that there's a lot of guesswork going on, right? Kind of filling in the missing pieces. But also another way of looking at it, how we're connecting the historical facts, the sources that we have. And it's very important that we are honest about where we're guessing, and we try not to engage in too much guessing. Too many suppositions can very much lead us astray from the truth of what happened. Ultimately, doing history means writing history, right? Constructing this broader narrative with information derived of written sources, usually mostly primary sources, sometimes buttressed by secondary ones, what other historians have written, in order to synthesize them into a larger narrative, right? And it's more than just simply linking events together. Remember, history ultimately, and this kind of comes out of the Enlightenment, trying to explain why things happened, establishing cause and effect. And that can be the tricky part, right? So, we have to be very careful not to confuse correlation with causation. The fact that A happened before B doesn't mean that A made B happen, and so forth. The kind of evidence we look at, of course, will determine what kind of cause and effect relations we find. And this becomes really relevant when we consider the different subgenres of history. Are we looking at the documents produced by important political figures doing a political history? Are we looking at sources more reflective of social developments, of kind of cultural factors, and so on? Sometimes it's not a matter that one is right and the others are wrong. In some ways, it's more, that each one is adding a different kind of component to our overall understanding of what happened in the past. Now, early on, the tendency had been, if we're talking about from Leopold von Ranke onward, the tendency was to focus on political history, right? Kind of focusing on supposedly important individuals. Sometimes we use the term great men, right? The people who mattered. Reflecting, of course, also a kind of bias towards men and against women, that somehow the things that women did tended not to matter or were discounted, but also reflecting that, if you're doing a political history and focusing on political leaders and so forth, throughout much of this period that history is often focusing on, women were not able to achieve high position. So, of late, I think there's been a tendency to kind of challenge this idea of, that great men make history. And it certainly is very problematic. I mean, first of all, how do we decide who is a great man? What makes one a great man? Is it simply the fact of holding political office? How do you measure influence? What about if we're talking about, kind of late 19th century Europe? I mean, should we be talking about kind of important economic figures, heads of companies and so forth? What criteria determines who is a great man? Then there is the question of what is the real impact such individuals have. And these are all very difficult things to quantify, like to quantifiably measure. And how do we account for the broader context of social structures, economic changes, and cultural ideas? You could have the same individual with the same qualities, even kind of the same position, but if you were to put them, into different historical periods, different historical contexts, their impact would likely be different because of the broader circumstances pertaining to other factors, economic, cultural, and social ones. Consider the example of Martin Luther. Who, very famously is attributed with starting the Protestant Reformation after he posted his 95 Theses on the door of a church in Wittenberg in what would become Germany in 1517. And this definitely did have a major Impact was a major factor in the eventual development of the Protestant Reformation. But what if he had posted, the exact same thing, posted 95 Theses 50 years earlier? Every other aspect of this story remains the same. It's just 50 years earlier. Would it have had the same impact? Most historians would say probably not. There were other individuals prior to Martin Luther that in many ways played a similar role, but for whatever reason, just never really caught fire, right? I mean, it's as if they were trying to get something started and it just kind of fizzled. And if you're focusing too much on this idea of that great men make history, then maybe you're putting too much weight on the characteristics of Martin Luther as somehow the kind of deciding factor, when probably there were just other factors, kind of the right man, but at the wrong time, the wrong place. Eventually, historians are going to begin focusing on other kinds of factors that don't really correspond to specific individuals, in a sense, really correspond to large groups, like economics, culture, social changes. One really important figure worth mentioning in this regard is Karl Marx, who most people are familiar with him as kind of laying the groundwork for the ideology of communism. But in addition to being a very, very brilliant economist, he was also kind of a historian, though one that focused on economic factors. And so, related to his analysis of economic conditions, and, it's okay, with communism, he's kind of anticipating what he thinks is going to happen, but he also talks a lot about, how Europe got to where it was as of the middle of the 19th century. And so he's going to define a lot of important social groups that categories that we still use today, like, the bourgeoisie. And focus on certain kinds of economic changes that we still consider important. But it's not just going to be economics, right? We're also going to see, in some ways, reflective of the influence of other developing disciplines like anthropology and sociology, historians focusing on other kinds of factors, related to patterns of behavior. Considering, for instance, if they change, like why did they change? The fact of certain kinds of transformations taking place, perhaps kind of creating a space for a particular individual to emerge into as playing an important role. So here we see not great men making history, but history making great men. Sometimes the focus is more on what didn't change. Right? So, a lot of history about the French Revolution, focusing on the kind of things that changed. But then there are some historians, one very famous one from the 19th century, Alex de Tocqueville, who focus more on what didn't change, kind of what was, what kind of continuity did you have between what existed prior to the French Revolution and after. And then, you start thinking about how all these different factors come together. What is the relationship between cultural attitudes and thinking, changes in social structures and economic behavior? And, then again, trying to find a place for individuals, perhaps, within the context of these other kinds of changes. Whatever kind of history you're telling, at some point you basically have to decide, where to begin. That's actually harder than it might sound, because, whatever your starting point, something happened before that in some fashion is relevant, but you got to start somewhere. I mean, unless you're going back to the Big Bang. And probably more importantly, which factors to include. So imagine you're writing a book about the origins or causes of something, right? I mean, you have to decide at some point, partly because of time and space constraints, which factors are you going to include, which are you going to omit. Imagine you're doing causes of the French Revolution. Well, inherent in, or causes of the Russian Revolution, World War I, whatever your topic, at some point, part of this process involves, kind of a ranking system. You have to decide which factors you think are most important, which are kind of, secondary factors, and then which are maybe very minor ones that you might have to omit altogether. Consider, for instance, if you're writing an article, whatever you're writing, you got to get it within like 20 pages. If you're writing a book, All right, maybe you can get into some of those more minor factors. You've got 200 plus pages to work with. In the end, you synthesize various factors that you believe came together to bring about a particular outcome. I might note there too that one aspect of this is going to be rhetorical. Ultimately, you're choosing your factors based on how important you think they are, but there is also this matter of persuading your reader that your thesis regarding, the causes or origins of a particular outcome are what you claim them to be. And so, maybe let's say 10% of your thinking in terms of what to include might also reflect a consideration of what's going to be persuasive to the reader. And then there's kind of like the basic tone of the narrative that you create. Many historians very often propose, and sometimes it would seem almost subconsciously, what might be called a grand narrative, where events, kind of follow this kind of linear progression, and it feels as if there's some kind of underlying hand guiding events. If you think about it, this is often how we tell stories, right? Whether it's like Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings or particularly epic stories, there's this kind of feeling that everything has to kind of end the way that it did end, and everything that happened before was always leading to that point. Nothing happens without a purpose, right? Everything happens, as if there's an underlying hand. Earlier it would have been God. Today it might be kind of some other driving force, but something guiding events. And in fact, today we do tend to still write that way. Probably the most common narrative is that of progress, right? So we write about, the history is about things getting better or failing to get better, but there is kind of always a value judgment in terms of the outcome, right? When things are getting better, we are progressing, right? We're overcoming racial prejudice. We're overcoming problems of inequality and so forth. And this is good. And when things don't move in that direction, we tend to, like we're taking a step back, right? So that kind of reflects, kind of a value judgment, one which, by the way, I share, but, that does kind of influence how we tell this story. And that brings us to the issue of trying to really appreciate the mindset of people in the past, right? I mean, so you might be, kind of deploying this narrative of progress where you view certain kinds of changes, transformations in the past as very positive, but they might not have been viewed by people at that time as positive, right? Or things that we see as, kind of very negative characteristic, reflective of religious intolerance, for instance, that wouldn't necessarily have been the mindset of people in the past. And that's one of the hardest things to really get at, right? To give an example, right? We were doing a history of, the persecution of people for witchcraft in early modern Europe, where they were basically accusing primarily women of being witches and then very often condemning them to death and burning them at the stake or hanging them. From our mindset, like there's just nothing good to be said for that. The mindset of people at the time probably quite different. They might have seen that as a good thing. You're purging the community of these harmful individuals and so forth. By the way, just recognizing a different mindset doesn't necessarily mean sympathizing with it. You can just present it as reflective of the mindset. Doesn't mean that you have to celebrate it. On the other hand, we don't want to get carried away. Are people in the past that different from us? So to what extent are they the same? To what extent different? But generally speaking, we often find that people did have a different way of thinking in the past, and we often refer to this as the cultural consciousness or a mentalité of a particular time. The term mentalité, first used by Lucien Febvre in the early 20th century, and in fact it is a French term that eventually became very strongly associated with a particular school known as the Annale school. And we are going to look at this particular school. And by school, I don't necessarily mean a building, made out of brick with classrooms and so forth. I'm talking about kind of like a school of thought, right? A way of approaching history that a number of individuals shared. And so this one was based in France, very prominent during the 50s and 60s. And so they would have a major impact on, even people who didn't belong to that school. Historians who didn't belong to that school would eventually be influenced by it. The analyst approach was to study the broad sweep of history. So this is as far from political history, kind of great men history, as you can get. They often talked about something called the longue durée. I mean, for them, it's like we're not interested in how things change from one decade to the other. We're kind of looking at history in much broader terms, like looking at and to some degree focus more on how things didn't change over long periods of time, perhaps centuries, right? And by doing this, we find these kind of deep-rooted currents that kind of define societies of the past. And in terms of change, I mean, they didn't deny that things did change, but they were trying to understand kind of, when kind of these broader frameworks transitioned into something else, and very often they saw this as reflective of kind of external factors like climatic changes or kind of broader societal changes reflective of economics. So major economic shifts. They were especially interested in mentalité, right? As kind of corresponding to this kind of these deeper unstated reasons why people do things. That people are kind of embedded in a particular mentality, and to some degree that kind of determines the nature of the behavior. And then eventually things start to change, and perhaps a new mentality emerges. But in any event, getting at the mentalite of a past people is hard. We very often have to read the material, the sources, in a way that their authors never intended, right? And by the way, in generally speaking, historical figures, when they produce primary sources, they were not producing them for the benefit of historians hundreds of years down the road, right? So we have to start with why did they produce them? That's probably the first thing as far as understanding how to read them. But in this case, if we want to get to the mentalite, we're looking beyond the literal meaning of what they're saying. And that can be tricky. The problem of nuance becomes very relevant there. So we really have to understand how words in the past were used, particularly if perhaps differently than in the present, and so forth. So, I don't want to get too deeply into that. This is kind of an introductory lecture, but we will be examining the Annale school in greater depth further down the line. And one last thing I might mention is kind of reflective of a certain kind of arbitrariness of historians is the whole process of labeling, right? We use labels to define historical periods, for instance, the Enlightenment, feudalism. We already talked about the Middle Ages. Generally speaking, these terms were not used by the people to whom they apply. So if you went back in a time machine to the Middle Ages, no one's going to say, welcome to the Middle Ages or the period of feudalism. In fact, feudalism is a historian's term invented later. So, you have to be kind of aware of that. Related to that, when you move from one historical period to another, it's not like people went to sleep in the High Middle Ages and woke up and it's like, gosh, something feels different. I think the Renaissance has begun, right? So very often, this does kind of correspond to maybe more of an analyst approach, right? These transitions are actually much more gradual than it might seem when reading the history. Very often there's a great deal of continuity between the one period to the next. If you're talking about, for instance, the Renaissance, for the vast majority of Europe, a lot of these kind of intellectual and artistic developments did not have an immediate impact. For them, life was not that different than what it had been during the High Middle Ages, and so on, right? So be aware of that. Again, history is not the past. History is, kind of an attempt at painting a picture or creating a framework for understanding the past. But it is helpful, as with all social sciences, if we remember that it is in fact a framework, it is not the reality itself that we are attempting to describe with it, right? They're two different things. Which brings us to one last question. Can we get to the truth of the matter? What is truth, historically speaking? Difficult question to answer. I don't want to say there's no such thing as truth, because that kind of implies that, anything anyone comes up with is somehow equally relevant. It's not quite that. Uh, Whatever history we're talking about, at some point, a consensus emerges among historians regarding certain aspects of it, maybe the basic contours of it. There will be a lot of debate about the particulars. Sometimes, important alterations based on, kind of some new insights or access to new sources. But ultimately, history is kind of a group discipline. When you become a historian, and let's say you're a historian of the French Revolution, you're basically joining a discussion that was already underway, right? You sit down at the table, other historians who've been there for quite a while, maybe a few that recently joined, are already discussing the French Revolution, its causes, the way in which it unfolded and so forth. And there is some consensus about, certain basic aspects of the French Revolution, but then there are other things that are being debated, disagreed over, and so forth. Eventually, people leave the table, some die, some retire, other people join the discussion. You never arrive at an endpoint. But you are, I would say, truth in a sense reflects more intent than what you're really able to achieve, right? That you join the discussion with kind of an honorable intention to really get to the heart of the matter, not to, intentionally distort facts or to misrepresent facts. To try and be as honest as you can in how you engage this discussion. If we're talking about truth, in the sense that very often we encounter contradictory sources, what do you do with that? Well, you have to account for all your sources, right? There might be some reason for believing a particular account is somehow more reliable than another, but sometimes there isn't. And probably the most honest thing you can do is to present both and, kind of discuss where they differ, what might be problematic because of that, what we can know, what we can't know. If you leave something out, you're kind of silencing that voice, right? This, this kind of concern underlay the development of women's history, right? Feminist approaches to history and so forth. The notion that women's voices were often silenced. There are other groups, what we call subaltern groups, those without power, African Americans, if you're talking about the Middle Ages, peasants and so forth, Jewish people in certain cases, that very often were marginalized or to some degree silenced, right? So as a historian, even though these sources might not conform to a, kind of clear, well-defined narrative of what happened, right? Kind of ends up making it a bit messy, muddying the waters, if you will. My recommendation is you have to account for it in some fashion. And this is a good place to stop. In the future, we might have a few more lectures like that. I'm definitely going to try and organize a couple of times where at least some of us can get together, maybe a couple of Zoom sessions, but might do multiple ones to try and give everyone an opportunity to take part. But to a very large extent, we're going to be moving forward based on the readings, on discussions that take place in the discussion forum. But one last note, remember, as in the syllabus, do feel free to contact me whenever is convenient to you. You have my iPhone number. I'm not going to say it here because this is going on YouTube, but do feel free to call me. If you get my voicemail, I'll try and get back to you as soon as I can. And again, don't hesitate, right? This is, we're a small enough group that I think I can handle it. I do have a toddler, so might not be able to pick up at that moment, but I promise you I will get back to you as soon as I can. So that's it, and let's see how it goes.